Okay, an opportunity to talk about some element of your uh, family research or family history that you think is particularly interesting, at least to you. Okay, so it's a sharing time, sharing family. Uh, Bonnie, I've got you lined up first. Okay, easy thing to do is to grab the microphone up there and turn it on. And then I have the slides with the wedding announcements in order. And then following that, I have the Gibson girl.
All right, great. Okay, I have three generations of wedding pictures and announcements. And the first picture is of my great grandparents. That's Katie and Adam Hitter. And Katie, or Catherine, is the daughter of my two times great grandmother that I talked about a few months ago. And she was the women's doctor at Ellis Island for 7 years. And I don't know how many of you were here when I gave that little presentation, but this is the doctor, Barbara Hartman, and her husband, Peter. So that's my two times great grandmother. But her daughter, Catherine, or Katie, and her husband were married in Brooklyn. And this is their wedding invitation of February 25th of 1894. Now, this isn't actually a wedding picture of them because we don't have one, but it was taken terribly long afterwards. So in the scheme of things, if you were here for that presentation about Dr. Hartman, this is 4 generations, and Dr. Hartman and her husband were over here, and Katie and Adam were on the other side. And then down in front, that little girl with that scowly look is my grandmother. And she would be the next slide coming up. There she is. That's Wilhelmina and John Boss. And we called her Billy. And that's their wedding announcement. And again, they were married in Brooklyn. And that is a wedding picture. And then the next one. Question?
Do you have any idea if that dress or the one will show up the next one still exists?
The dress?
Yeah.
Which dress? That's this dress?
Yeah.
If it still exists. No, I
No,
don't.
okay. Just checking.
No. It's a pretty dress, though.
Yeah. The hat looks quite modern.
Well, yeah, it does kind of, I guess. But what I think is interesting is the flowers. She's not holding them. They're kind of attached to her dress, which they kind of called a nosegay in those days. And I guess that was so that you could constantly be smelling the aroma of it. I don't know, but I thought that was rather interesting that she's not holding her flowers. Yeah. My grandfather was 7 years older than my grandmother, and he was very successful. And they used to have, my mother would tell me this, they used to have like Great Gatsby parties all the time, all the time. And he was totally unaffected by the Depression. He was a broker, and you know, my mother was wearing fur coats when she was 4 years old or something. But anyway, he ran a big office, and he said a lot of his friends were terribly affected by the Depression to the point where they would come into his office every day all dressed just to have a desk to sit at and use the telephone to try to get another job. And, you know, it was terrible for a lot of people. Thankfully, not so much for my family, but he gave all these men a place to try to find a job and not have to spend the day at home just being depressed. But that was my grandpa. He didn't retire until he was 72 years old, and he bought a boat because he loved to fish. And on the day that he was launching his boat, he dropped dead on the dock of a heart attack. So that's kind of a sad end. But my grandmother lived to her mid 90s, and her mother before her also lived to her mid 90s. The next picture is my parents. That would be their daughter. Yeah, that's my mom and dad, and that's their daughter. And her name is Muriel Barbara, but she was called Bobby. And my dad, John, actually it was William, but they called him John. I mean, nobody in our family went by their real name except for the dog. You know, everybody else was nicknamed or middle name or something. But this was taken 1941. So it was the 10th of May in 1941. And I don't have that dress either, which is, I think, is kind of cute. But my dad also passed away at 72. In fact, a lot of men in our family, my grandfather, my uncle, my brother-in-law, my father, they all passed away at 72. And the women lived a nice long time. My mother lived to be 103. Yeah, I don't want to live that long. But that's how long she lived. So anyway, those are the three generations of wedding pictures and announcements and invitations that I have in the, you know, in my family. But some of you may remember a few months ago, I gave a presentation on my dad's mother, who was a Gibson girl. And I'm not sure how many of you were here for that, but that's my dad's mother. And her name was Alix Ludegard Evans. And then she married my grandfather, and his last name was Goff. So the interesting thing about her is that she was a Gibson girl. And I don't really want to bore you with the whole presentation again, but I was asked the last time, are there any of the drawings, you know, of her by Charles Dana Gibson? And at the time I said, yeah, there must be, you know, in my family, but, you know, I don't have them. So I was in Southern California shortly thereafter, and I was talking to my older sister, and I asked her, I said, do we have any pictures of Grandma Ludi? And she said, oh yeah, I think we do, you know. So she brought out these two Gibson Girl books. They're albums, really, and like from like 1906. And she said, yeah, our mother sat down with me and she said, oh, there she is. And she turned the page and, oh, there she is again. Oh, there she is. But nobody marked the pages. And of course, you know, there aren't many pictures, photographs of my grandma, and we weren't especially close to her. So I don't know what she looked like as a young woman. All I knew her was, you know, an old lady. But so my sister gave me the two albums, and I went through one of them, which is book 2. This is book 1. And in book 2, there are no place marks or anything. So I'm going through and, you know, I didn't know who's who. So, but I went through book 1 and there were little torn pieces of newspaper that were on several pages. And I took that to mean that probably, you know, somewhere there were pictures of her. So I took those out and I put in, little cardboard pieces so that we can see. And I'm not 100% sure which one she is, but we know she's in this book at least 6 times. So, and for those of you that don't know what a Gibson girl is, how many of you were here when I talked about that? Just Peter. Okay. Um, anyway, just quickly, Charles Dana Gibson was an illustrator. He was an American illustrator and artist, and he would draw pictures um, of the signature look for women, young women at that time. And this time was about late 1800s to around 1920. And it was a definition of how American beauty probably should look. Young women in ready to wear clothing and just kind of the ideal look. Beautiful eyes, pouty lips, big hair. But in addition to all that, she would be athletic and educated and liberated, but not pushy. And she would be sexy, but not sleazy. And in many cases, she would be kind of an equal to or smarter than the male counterpart, which was very progressive for its time. And he never put down the fact that she could be a wife or a mother. That was always a given. But he did illustrations that were in Life magazine and Collier's and Harper's Weekly, and maybe they were for comics, or maybe they were for just an advertisement or just a picture, And so he was quite the artist. And my grandmother started modeling for him when she was about 18. And he would just pull these women from high society. And she was in a very wealthy family. So, she was already a debutante and everything. So she was his model for about 6 years until she got married. And so what I don't want to do is I don't want to take up any more time because I know other people have stories, but I've, afterwards, if you want to come up and see some of the pictures, I'd be happy to show you. The book is really very delicate, but I could show you just maybe one right now so you could see if it's something you want to look at. But anyway, that's my story.
Sounds great, Bob. I should, I'm going to send you a separate note. It may be possible using some of the advanced AI that we have now to actually let the AI look at a picture. And as long as you have a place to start, okay, which I think that this is a place to start, the one you've got up here, okay, they can do a facial recognition, and then the fact that you have some pages marked, they'll look for the common ones in those pages. Okay. Now I'll have to deal a little bit with the mechanics of that. Oh, wow. Neat. Okay. Are we ready to move on? Diana, you're on. You can come up and grab the microphone. You can do it from down there. I can scroll the slides. It'd be useful to do a background as to where we're going.
Sure. Hello, hello. My name is Diana DeCara. My maiden name is Hughes, which is Welsh. I am only 33% Welsh. My uncle who did the genealogy was half Welsh. And we always had a fascination for the Welsh. And finally, he retired and he started doing genealogy. And so we met relatives from Wales. They came over. I had 17 people at my house at one time. And they were camped out in campers, everything. Then we decided to go to Patagonia because the Welsh went to Patagonia after they came to America. Some of them went straight to Patagonia. They wanted out of England. They now call it UK. You cannot say that they are English, they are UK because they are a country. Let's see, my great grandfather, Ishmael, was born in 1870. He came over here in 88. And so I'm not quite sure about Annie Hughes when she came over. Yes, and the Welsh still go down there to see, and the Welsh down there have integrated into Spanish also. So there's a lot of Spanish last names, but we were the first to come there in 125 years. So one of my relatives, Annie Hughes' husband, died. He died because his horse kicked him. It was all horses back then, and they would cross the river. And they didn't sit on the horse. They floated him back, holding on to the horse's tail, and he got kicked. And so he died. So my other cousin from Wales, Erwin Jones, was over with us, and we found out that her great grandmother came over to help Annie Hughes because she had kids. But her great grandmother left a bunch of kids at her house. So we couldn't figure that one out. And there was a story about Erwin's, I think her name was Margaret, had false teeth. Well, there was some teenage boys, young teenage boys, and they were playing around and they happened to smash her teeth. And that's why she went back to Wales. She had to get new teeth. So when we went down there, we had, it was my uncle, Erwin, me, and Javier. Javier is Argentinian, and he is, yes, that's Javier right there. And he is a foreign exchange student that I had staying at my house. Well, he could speak Spanish, and none of us were very good at it. So he would be our interpreter. Dick Hughes is the guy in the red with the backpack, holding the backpack. And Erwin Jones is right next to him on the right. And those are all my relatives. There was 50 some of them at a asada that we had. And that was where they cooked it at. I didn't get all the pictures to come through on the computer. But they were definitely, they were so thrilled. They took us all over. This is my uncle in the middle. One of the guys was named Old Horse. They kept in touch. The Spanish speaking was hard to keep in touch with, but my uncle seemed to do better than I did on it. Most of those guys are dead now. My uncle is deceased. We went from Buenos Aires to Trevelin, no, to Esqual, then Trevelin, and then we went to Gammon, and Gammon is around where they were first at. When the Welsh came over to Patagonia, was Chubut. They lived in caves. And the country was so different. This is arid country. And they came from like New England. you know, it rains and lots of rocks and stuff. So they had to learn how to farm all over again.
Is this Argentina or Chile?
Argentina. We did go into Chile just to have fun and go over, but they didn't like Chile. The Esqual had a chance to become Chilean or stay as Argentina. And they voted and said they don't want to be Chilean. They wanted to stay Argentina. So there's lots of stories. There's a story on a horse named Malachi. And I'm not a very good storyteller though, but it was a fantastic trip. We were on the go for 2.5 weeks. We were so tired by the end.
Do you still have family in Wales?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I now FaceTime with them. I have the Welsh are all over the place, like the Ohioans. So I have relatives in Canada. Let's see, there is one that went to France, I think even. But it's Anglesey, which is an island in Wales, and it's right across this Holyhead. You can take a boat and go over to Dublin. It's that close. And they hate the English.
And they are not English.
And they are not English.
Yeah, I have family from Wales and family from Cornwall. Okay. And so they're amazingly close together geographically,
Yeah.
but don't have anything to do with each other.
What part of Wales? I do have some pictures that if you guys want to look at them later.
Okay.
We just moved here. I found a CD that had a bunch of pictures. My computer's not set up yet, so I had trouble. But anyways, I found a few. So
Right. Okay. Sure. Grab the microphone.
Okay, I'm Peggy Dombeck, and I'm going to tell a story about, I think it is on. I can hear it. I think he's a second cousin, but anyway, it's a cute story. So this story was written by his daughter. I've neglected to write the time frame, but I think it's before World War I, sometime in the early 1900s. So she wrote, "Here's my father's story. After his parents died within 6 months of each other, because one refused to live without the other and just wasted away," my father said. He was about 13 or so. His name was Aaron. He was about 13 or so, and there was only his brother in the army and his sister, who might have been married at the time, with him in Mogilev, Belarus, which was at that time part of the Russian Empire. And they called it White Russia. They couldn't look after him, so they asked the rest of the siblings who lived in Toronto, Canada, to take him. So finally, he started out on his way to Canada. By horse and wagon. He had instructions to get to Hamburg, Germany, and get on a ship going to Canada. It took a long time to get there, and when he did, it was winter and no ships were leaving for Canada until spring. He had the address of a woman who had lived or been in his hometown, which was called Mogilev, but now lived in Berlin. So he got to Berlin and he asked her what to do. She suggested he work for her husband, who had workshops and stores for clothing and furs, and live with them. He did. He was no great writer, ever. So he didn't write to his siblings to let them know. Where he was, figuring that in a few months he'd be on his way again. Meanwhile, I got the timing right. Meanwhile, the First World War broke out. And he, as an enemy alien, had to report every day to the German police for over 4 years. Meanwhile, he fell in love with that woman's stepdaughter, who was his age. So when the war ended, he stayed on. She got engaged to a rich young man, and his heart broke, and he told her that he loved her. She said she'd hoped so, but he never said anything. So she broke off her engagement and told her father and stepmother that she was going to marry him. Not very happily, they agreed. But insisted on giving them an apartment. My father refused, saying that now he had to continue the trip that had been interrupted. My grandfather, the Polish-German one, insisted that he couldn't let his daughter go to wild Canada till my father got a job and a home there. So in 1920, my father and mother got married, and my father went off to Toronto. He had lost the addresses he'd had, so he took with him my mother's aunt's address in Toronto. She rented out rooms, so she gave him one. One of the girls who rented a room from her told the girls at work in the factory that the handsomest man she'd ever seen had just rented a room in the same house. He looked like Rudolph Valentino, the movie star, she said. They asked her to bring a picture of him, so she stole one from the living room for a day to show the girls. When she did, one of the girls she worked with fainted. It was my Aunt Hilda. She recovered and said, if my little brother were alive today, that's what he'd look like. So they found each other. And my father finally got in touch with his brother and sisters. A year later, he'd rented a room with the use of a bathroom, and my mother came over to Toronto. Oh.
I have to thank Peggy for a lot of the maps that she did of Eastern Europe and the exodus of a lot of our relatives my relatives came from Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. So my daughter was living in Berlin a couple years ago. So we decided to go back and visit her there. And as long as we were there, I thought, let me go to, well, Ukraine, no. Poland, probably not. But Lithuania looked like a good place to visit. And my last name is Miller, Katya Miller. And so I feel closest to the Miller family, who would have been from Vilnius. And then I found out they were also from Kaunas, which is about an hour drive from Vilnius. So we flew to Lithuania, stayed about 3 nights in Vilnius. And I had asked around for the best Jewish guide there. And she met us the day after we arrived. And she was pretty sharp. She really took us to some great places. And then she suggested we rent a car and go to Kaunas, and on the way, stop at the cemetery and look up the Miller family plots and the Swirsky plots. So we did find some. I have them in here. Oh, good. And here, I'll pass this around. We found some Miller family and Swirsky family, but I'm sure all our direct relatives had left. But some of the family was there, so that was great. So this is my, this is Jaime Miller. And he's got this book. You could tell he was a learned man. He probably went to the yeshiva. And I think he was considered a rabbi, but then a rabbi was a teacher. They didn't necessarily have a congregation. So when I moved to Oakmont, I kind of became obsessed with felt hats. And so I looked on, why don't you go to the next one? I looked on Etsy for a winter hat for myself. This would be my grandmother, the Maltzman side, from Ukraine. So this is Charles Maltzman. And you notice he's also wearing this hat. They're squared off hats. And I think Eliyahu was telling me about them. I forget what he says. I think I wrote it down in there. So why don't you go to the next one? So this is my obsession with these hats that I started getting on Etsy from this Ukrainian lady who was making them. And it took me a few years to make the connection between these hats that I loved that were kind of squared off and my relatives. And it was this aha moment between these wool felt hats and Charles Maltzman and Jaime Miller. So that I love that story. But then I wanted to keep buying them, but a couple of years into the war, with the Ukrainian war, I couldn't find her anymore. Okay, next. So, you know, my daughter was living in Berlin and she had an apartment that she ended up renting to a Ukrainian family. And it was a mom, a grandmother, and two sons. And they were excited when we came to town and they cooked us dinner one night. It was so nice to be with them. They lived in like a 1-bedroom apartment, 4 of them. And they cooked this meal that was just like what my grandmother would have cooked from the Ukraine. It was borscht, and it was just all these meats that she would have cooked and soup and anyway, it was great. So then we went to Kaunas and we went to the old city. And I'll tell you what, go to the next one. Okay, so it was a rainy day and we're walking on the old city of Kaunas and this is what it looked like. And I just like could feel my family there. It was really going back in time. It was great. So then I looked on the internet, I think it was eBay. I looked under Kaunas and next slide. And I found this postcard. I was shocked. I'm pretty sure that says Kauno. Maybe it's not Kaunas. I don't know. But anyway, the brick walkways, driveways I guess they had horse and buggy. It just reminded me, it just felt like the same place. When we first got there, we were dropped off at turns out there's a university there, a big university. And so maybe it went from a place of learning to now a big, huge university. And that the slide two before, there was just, yeah, there was just beautiful old, some old, some new brick buildings, but I loved this with they had a lot of artwork around with the thumbprint on it, on the brick. I thought that was cool. Anyway, so that's short and sweet, but I come from a San Francisco family, and my father, Abe Miller, and his brother, Leon Miller, started these little corner grocery stores that grew into 17 supermarkets. And then I found out that those were the first supermarkets in San Francisco. So that was cool. Anyway, that's all for now. Yeah. I don't really know, but there, if you look in that, the pictures I have, you'll see some gravestones with the name Miller on. So it must be. Know anything?
Yes, Müller is a, very popular German name, which translated as would be Miller. The Millers I know have been Jewish, yeah.
Yeah, and from what I hear, my grandfather was a grain miller, and he felled trees, so he would have milled trees. So, yeah, so it's usually related to the work you do. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thanks for listening.
So I've got a couple of slides I want to run of my own. Anybody else who want to share something today? Peter? Grab the mic.
So this is really short. When the Nuremberg laws came out in Germany, they took away citizenship from Jewish people. And so my father, mother, and I lost our citizenship. And during that process, my parents decided to go to Milano, to Italy, as some of you may know, and we lived there. So I was born actually in Zurich and in Switzerland for reasons that are too complicated to go into now. But I never got a Swiss citizenship. So I actually was a non-citizen until 1939, just before actually, that's not right. It was in 5 years later. So 1945, when the war was over, I became a Canadian citizen. So my children have asked me if they could get their German citizenship through me, because there's a provision for that says that any Jews whose citizenship was taken away from them can apply. So it took about 2 years and translating documents, and which for me was had the side benefit of really understanding aspects of our history that were more remote, sorry, and which came to light. But the good news is that about a week ago, I went to the German consulate in San Francisco, and I am now a German citizen. And my parents might roll over in their graves, I can tell you. What? Why would you, are you Meshuggah? But for me, there's something emotionally about restoring something that was taken away, that was very meaningful. And I have 5 kids, and with my grandchildren, there were 9 of us that became German citizens all at once. So that's a little anecdote.
Neat. Okay, yes? Right, grab the microphone.
My name is John Gurman, and what I'm going to talk about is the house that my grandparents had. These were my paternal grandparents. They both came over independently from Slovakia, which was called Upper Hungary at the time, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they came over in the early 1900s. They lived in Cleveland. They ended up meeting at a dance in Cleveland, got married and lived there for a while. But my grandfather had a stepbrother who lived out in Weymouth, Ohio, which was out in the country. It was out in the boonies at the time. And he would go out there and he loved the area because it had hills. He was from the part of the Hungarian plain where it was dead flat. And so to see hills was a unusual and nice thing for him. This house went on the market, if you could call it market at the time. He bought it. He bought it because it had a hill. And he loved that hill. And every visitor who came to his house had to go up and see the view from the hill, which was a very nice view, I have to say. But the house itself was built in 1838. It was a stagecoach inn. It was about a day's journey from Cleveland, a day's journey from Akron, and a Y on the road, and a day's journey from Worcester, which heading down towards Columbus, Ohio. So one time it was a going thing. The fellow who built it was a surveyor for the county of Medina. He had a couple of mills down the river further on down, so he was pretty well to do, but he built a house and lived there. This house was a medium-sized house, 2-story, fairly plain, although they put a wraparound porch on 2 sides of it later on. And it had oak beams that were about 2 feet in width. They were massive oak beams. You could see where they were upstairs. They've since removed the plaster from them so you can actually see the exposed wood beams in the upstairs. But it was an unusual house. It had no water. It had no electricity because this was 1927. And my grandmother was not real happy moving out there because she lived in Cleveland and she got used to having electricity and running water. So eventually he paid to have electric poles put in for the wiring, which was fairly expensive at the time, but it was part of the electrification program. And in the 40s, he had the electricity run. I have the receipts from when they did that and what he paid for it. They had to have 3 electrical appliances in order to get in that program and get the loan to get the electricity, which they have. So I have the receipts for all of that. Water. They had water that was run down from a spring up on the hill, and it was gravity fed, and it ran to the barn. He extended it to the house, and that had enough water pressure from his hill, which was really a pretty modest hill, but it ran enough so that they could get water in the to the upper 2nd story. So it was fairly good head. The house was they bought it from an Italian family. The fellow who owned the house had dropped dead at a Christmas party the year before. He was Italian. He had a speakeasy there because this was in the 20s. And it was well known as a speakeasy in the area. There was a card room upstairs that had a door with a peephole in it. Didn't have a little slot on it, just a little peephole. And my wife and I, when we lived there for a short time, we found that door up in the attic. So it still exists. The house was, well, anyway, my grandfather bought the place from the Italian fellow. My grandfather eventually put in vineyards. It turns out that table grapes do make wine as well. My grandfather enjoyed his wine, I guess keeping the tradition alive. But the house was home to the family over many generations. There were often 3 generations living there at the same time. My grandparents lived downstairs. My dad and mom lived upstairs shortly after the war and put a kitchen in the upstairs. Another aunt and uncle came and lived there later on and raised their 3 kids. Um, so they lived there for quite a while. And then after they moved out, my wife and I lived there after we came back from Germany, from military service, and lived there for a short time while we were getting established. Several of my cousins lived there. I think 3 or 4 of my cousins lived there. It was a place where you lived when you were starting out in the family and getting going and didn't have much. So the rent was cheap. It was all very good. Everybody enjoyed it. And it was good because my grandparents had company there and somebody to help take care of the place. So I have very fond memories of that place. It was extensively remodeled. At one point, it reportedly had 7 chimneys, which I think is not true. I think it may have had 7 fireplaces because it was an inn after all. And my grandfather took them all down, put one central fireplace in there. My dad put the electricity in when he was in his early 20s. And it has a lot of family history tied into it. Just recently, it is not in the family and hasn't been for several decades, but just recently it sold. We were very concerned that how good a shape is a house that was built in 1838? How modernized is it? And we were concerned it was going to be knocked down and because the land is quite nice. We were afraid it was going to have a little mansion put on it or something like that. But it turns out that people who bought it, and they've only had it for less than a year, they're enjoying it. The interior is in very good shape, has been renovated. The exterior needs work, but they're putting the work into it and doing so. The house is going to still stand. It still exists. And when we have our family reunions, everybody has to go by the house and see it and revisit their memories. So that was my memory.
So very quickly, I said this was about weddings. This is my favorite wedding picture. Okay, the minister is my great grandfather, who was in fact he ran a circuit minister. He would marry people throughout the circuit. This happened, it was about a 2-mile road from the main road up to his house. And as he was coming down with his son and granddaughter, and it's the granddaughter who did the watercolors by Aunt Ollie, as he was coming down with them, they met this couple going up to go to his home to get married because he would marry them. So that's what he did. He just stopped right where he was, pulled out his Bible, and got them married. And that was one of my Aunt Ollie's very favorite memories. And then very quickly, 2 other. Okay, this is my great-great-grandfather and all of his children, and that's his wife just to his left in the front row. But this was at their 50th wedding anniversary, but that wasn't what really counted. It's the next picture, which I don't have a really good copy of. That's the whole family. So the very back, the very tall man is my grandfather. On his right is my grandmother, and in her arms is my father. This is all taken Southern West Virginia. Okay. And then just to finish up, I had to compete with the Gibson girl. So this is my grandmother as one would think of her. Okay. That's how she wanted to be thought of. She was a teacher for 50 years, very educated, but she was also a farmer's wife. And I swear he was a photographer. And I swear the next picture is not one that she would, I think it was almost a put together picture. But that's the same period as the Gibson girl. Okay. Next time I'm going to be talking about DNA. Okay. And I would urge you, if you have any real questions about DNA, and just to send them to us. Okay. All right. Now, Maria and I are going to zoom out of here because we've got a 2 o'clock class down at Lifelong Learning. And if you want to show a picture.
Wants to see some of these pictures. The book is a little bit heavy, but this, or you can come up if you want to. Yeah. No, I just got it a couple months ago. It probably would be, yeah. So.
something else. Now there's